If you want to learn what a sus chord is, or a suspended chord, then this is the video for you. Put basically, a sus chord or a suspended chord is a chord where you take the third of the chord out and instead replace it with usually a fourth, but sometimes a second. So a normal chord or normal triad is usually a first, a third, and a fifth. For example, in a major triad or a major chord, you have a first, your root note, and then you have a major third and then a perfect fifth. But in the case of a suspended chord, we're actually ripping that third out and replacing it with a fourth or a second. So first let's start with the most common sus chord. The most common sus chord is actually a sus4 chord. So if you ever see something like D sus on a chord sheet, that means a D sus4, because that is the most common and default suspended chord. So what that means is we're ripping out that third and we're replacing it with, you guessed it, a fourth. Let's start with a D major triad, which would be a D, an F sharp, and an A. First, we need to rip out the third, which is the F sharp, in order to make room for the perfect fourth that we're going to be adding to replace it for our suspended chord. So a perfect fourth interval is the same as 5 semitones, so we count 5 semitones or notes up from D in order to figure out what our suspended note is. So we start with D, go D sharp, E, F, F sharp, G. That is our final note in our D sus chord. Another way to think of this is in the case of a sus chord or a sus4 chord, we're basically taking the major variant of the chord and then taking the third and going one note higher. How we know this is that a major chord has a major third, and the very next interval after a major third is a perfect fourth. And a perfect fourth is what we are replacing our major third with in order to make a sus chord. In the case of a sus2 chord, we're doing the same thing, except instead of a perfect fourth we're adding a major second. Let's take the example of a D chord again. So we started with a D, F sharp, and A. We're ripping out the F sharp, and now we're replacing it with a major second. Major second is 2 semitones, so we go 2 semitones up from a D. Starting with D, D sharp, E. So we know that our D sus2 chord would be a D, an E, and an A. Another way to think of this is if you take a minor chord or a minor triad and you take the third of it and lower it one more note, you are basically creating a sus2 chord. How do we know that? Well, we know that our sus2 chord is getting rid of the third and instead replacing it with a major second. And a major second is exactly 1 semitone lower than a minor third, which is the third that we had in our minor chord. If this was helpful to you, be sure to drop a like on this video. It helps me out with the YouTube algorithm. And if you're interested in learning even more about music theory, and specifically the music theory that songwriters need to know, be sure to pick up my free guide at songwritertheory.com/music theory guide. It teaches the 4 pillars of music theory that I think every single songwriter needs to know. There's a lot of music theory that's really helpful, like what we talked about today with sus chords. I think those are really helpful, but there are 4 pieces of music theory that I think are absolutely necessary for songwriters in order to write more effectively and more efficiently. And I teach those 4 things in that free guide, so be sure to pick it up. Link in the description. Thank you so much for watching, and I will talk to you next time.